Well, thank you. Since I'm speaking sort of like a sandwich between two talks on space, I thought I would begin my talk with a comparison between space exploration and ocean exploration, because my guess is that you're all much more familiar with some of the challenges of space exploration. So let's start with just looking at powering instruments and platforms in space. In the case of most space vehicles that are put up, they can use solar panels and can fly anywhere in the solar system and power their instruments using solar platforms or using solar panels. Unfortunately, under the ocean, sunlight doesn't penetrate more than a few meters deep, and therefore we don't have that advantage of being able to use solar power for powering our instruments. And therefore we're dependent on batteries for the most part, or in this case we're going to be running in just a few weeks' time a fiber optic cable from, this is my institute here in Monterey Bay in California. We'll be running a cable out to the deep sea in order to supply power to instruments on the ocean floor. Now, we've been running a seismometer system out here in the deep sea for a couple years now. It is the only seismometer west of the San Andreas fault system that is continuously recording data. In order to keep that seismometer operating, we have to go out with a remotely operated vehicle, dive it down to the bottom of the ocean, and change its lithium batteries every 4 months, so that's 3 times a year. It costs us $10,000 in lithium batteries and $10,000 in ship time every time we do it, so that's about $60,000 a year to power that one seismometer. Once we have the cable out and can hook it to the power plant, that's 7 cents worth of electricity. So you can see that power is a real challenge in the deep sea. It's expensive to get it there. It's expensive to keep instruments working. So definitely when it comes to powering, the advantage is in space exploration. Now let's look at communicating with instruments and platforms. In the case of space, again, because radio waves can be transmitted through space, one can sit at JPL at mission headquarters and communicate with spacecraft. Under the ocean, we can't do that because electromagnetic radiation does not penetrate through the ocean. So we either have to use, for autonomous vehicles, very low baud rate acoustic communications, or we have to have some kind of tether that goes from the ship to a deep sea vehicle at all times. So those are great limitations as to how we communicate with instruments at the bottom of the ocean. So again, I'd say the advantage goes to space in terms of communication. If we look at the problem of fouling, we can put instruments up in space and we can leave them there for years, and they look pretty much the same years later as the day we put them up. However, if we put instruments on the bottom of the ocean, this was an acoustic current profiler that was left 3 months in Monterey Bay. And when we pulled it up, this is what it looked like. Now, you heard earlier today from Norman Packard about his desire to make life reproduce. Well, we'd really like to get life to stop reproducing, because this turns out to be one of the most expensive parts of putting instruments in the ocean is the biofouling. We also get geofouling. This was an instrument, a seismometer, that was put down on the Juan de Fuca Ridge offshore Washington and Oregon in September of 1991, and it was powered through a thermocouple that went to a hydrothermal hot spring on the mid-ocean ridge there. When the crew came back just a few months later, this is what that seismometer looked like. It had been encased in a massive sulfide deposit, and obviously that wasn't working very well anymore either. So again, when it comes to fouling, the advantage is working in space. However, let's go to the launch. All right. Now, you already heard from Peter the large cost of putting things up in space and how long it took to win the prize. And it's because escaping gravity on Earth is a very, very difficult job. It's risky, it's expensive, it requires a lot of energy. But now, last time I checked, every time we threw something off the side of a ship, it indeed sank to the bottom of the ocean. So in that case, definitely there's the advantage for the ocean in terms of the launch. And in fact, this becomes a real trump card. It's the reason why so many young scientists don't want to become space scientists, because they know that they'll have to come up for tenure before their instrument might ever go up in space. And it's why so many older scientists despair, leave space sciences, and become oceanographers, because they don't want to be operating their spacecraft with the joystick on their wheelchair in the retirement home. Just about all the oceanographers I know do go out to sea, and they do see their instruments operating, whereas it can be a very long wait to get your instruments into space. And that's something that it sure sounds like Peter's trying to change. Okay, so when we look at ocean exploration, we have two fundamental ways we go about it. One is with tethered vehicles. This is the Tiburon, one of our remotely operated vehicles, and you'll see the moon pool doors in our ship opening that open it up to the ocean to drop this vehicle into it. This vehicle is unmanned. It goes to 4 kilometers deep in the ocean. It has on it camera systems that can view in stereo. It has manipulator arms, sampling. It basically is the scientist's eyes, ears, nose, everything in the deep sea. But the way that we operate this is through a cable that brings power from the ship and control from a joystick of a scientist actually sitting up in the lab on the ship operating into the bottom of the ocean. It turns out this is a pretty expensive operation. We have to have several pilots on board the ship. We have to have the ship running. It costs $20,000 a day to run the ship. This is a pretty expensive way to run. Now, on the other hand, if we look at the autonomous underwater vehicles, these vehicles are battery powered. They have very sophisticated artificial intelligence on board, such that you pre-program them with a mission and you send them on their way. So for missions in which you don't need that umbilical cord to connect you to the scientist's brain at all times, this is definitely the much less expensive way to operate. These vehicles are an order of magnitude cheaper to build, and they're an order of magnitude cheaper to operate than the tethered vehicles. Now, NASA has caught on to this idea too. I'm sure you're all familiar with Spirit and Opportunity, the recent Mars rovers, which have returned so much data. Now, in the case of Spirit and Opportunity, these were the first times when these rovers on another planet actually use this kind of sophisticated artificial intelligence that we've been using underwater for a while. And the reason is because of the fact that NASA could, from JPL, from Mission Control, control these with joysticks back on Earth. They did. And finally, one of their engineers said, why don't we use artificial intelligence? We can actually increase the return from the mission and do it more cheaply. And they did, and they found out that they got minimum a 20% increased return on mission when they were able to use artificial intelligence to control these rather than joystick control at all times from Mission Control. So this is a case where there's some technology that we've used underwater which has come back to space, and many examples that go the other way. So now what I'd like to do is talk to you just a little bit about some of the research opportunities using these kind of tools underwater. And I thought I'd talk to you first about one that I think is very socially relevant, and that is global change. As you know, there's a lot of concern about the decreasing extent of Arctic ice in response to global warming. But in addition, we're interested to know how much is the ice cap thinning. So we took one of these autonomous underwater vehicles and built it to do a mission under the Arctic ice cap. We're going to let this AUV go in the Fram Straits and send it under the Arctic ice cap and pick it up again in the Bering Sea. In order to do this mission, the autonomous underwater vehicle was fixed with 2 midsections. One of the midsections has a semi-fuel cell in it so that it can run 2 weeks straight without having to be refueled. The other midsection in it is shown here, blown up in our test tank. And let me just play this little video to show you. This midsection in it has sort of a a little Gatling gun type thing in it with these little torpedoes. And as the torpedoes have in them computer disks, and the disks record all the data that has been captured by the AUV on its trek under the ice. And once the sonars find a thin place in the ice, they open the trap door, release one of these torpedoes, and it rights itself on its way up under the water. And you can see one here over on the edge that's come up under the ice. Once it hits the ice, it releases a chemical which heats up the nose cone. It burns its way up through the ice, pops up a little antenna, and phones home to send its data back to MBARI. And that way we knew that even if we didn't recover the autonomous underwater vehicle, we would get all the data in stages as it was captured. And these plots just show some of the data that was taken on one of the inaugural missions of this vehicle. And basically, as the vehicle was porpoising up and down through the water column, it was measuring temperature, salinity, optical backscatter to show what kind of life was under the ocean, oxygen and nitrate. And what we found was one of the most erosive agents in thinning the ice cap was an intrusion of very warm sailing North Atlantic water that's coming in under the ice cap and melting it from below. Now, in terms of another socially relevant research topic that we're using these vehicles for, it's looking at what I consider one of the least discussed, but one of the more troublesome effects of global warming, and that is the fact that we're changing the pH of the ocean and we're gradually turning it to acid. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the release of CO2 to the atmosphere, how that's changing the chemistry of the atmosphere and leading to an increase in the greenhouse effect. Well, the ultimate repository for that excess CO2 is it will come into equilibrium with the ocean, which is undersaturated right now in CO2, and it will become dissolved in the ocean. As more CO2 becomes dissolved in the ocean, it reduces its pH and it becomes more acid. This is a plot that shows, starting in the year 1750, going up through the first industrialization and up through the year 3000, how the pH in the ocean will change as a function of depth from the surface down to about 4.5 kilometers. And you can see right now we're in about the year 2000, a little past it. We're already seeing the changes. And by the end of this century, the upper ocean will be more acidic than it has been in 400 million years of life evolution on this planet. So we can safely say that there are no organisms in the ocean that will ever have seen pH values as low as they will be by the end of this century. So the problem is, how is that going to affect processes in the ocean? Well, earlier today, we heard from Graham Flint about the fact that acid rain is destroying Rome and the Vatican City. Well, why is acid rain doing that? Well, it's made of limestone. Well, what is limestone? Limestone is a rock that is formed in shallow seas when calcareous organisms die and formed rocks. These are calcareous organisms that grow in the ocean. They are a very important part of the carbon cycle. They capture carbon in the upper ocean, and when they die, they take it down to the bottom of the ocean. They form carbonate rocks, which sequester CO2 out of the ocean. Now, as the acid changes in the ocean, acid dissolves limestone, and the shells of all of these organisms become very thin, and that carbon transport to the deep sea stops happening. So this is something to be very worried about in terms of the entire carbon cycle on the planet as the ocean becomes more acid. But there are other things we're worried about too. For example, how will the lowering of pH affect oceanic photosynthesis? Do animals in the upper ocean have the capacity to buffer their cellular functions against changes in pH? And can deep sea organisms adapt to changing pH? Now, right now at my institution, we're doing experiments on this. Zbigniew Kolber is looking at the effects in the upper ocean. Peter Brewer is looking at effects in the deep sea. Some of these effects in the upper ocean can actually be simulated in the lab, but in the deep sea they can't, because pressures are very important in the outcome of these experiments, and if we don't do them under the right pressure conditions, we won't get the right answers. For example, this is what carbon dioxide looks like at 4 kilometers depth in the ocean. It's actually pools of liquid because the gas goes into a liquid form once you get down to 4 kilometers depth. This shows a little fish happily swimming past these pools of CO2 in the deep sea. And for the most part, mobile organisms tend to avoid the CO2 and aren't too affected by it. But sessile organisms like sea cucumbers and mollusks and other things that can't move will be very much affected by the changing pH in the ocean. This is just a little device we've built and installed in the bottom of the ocean with our ROV to do controlled experiments of taking a volume of seawater, increasing the CO2 to the values that are expected by the end of this century, and finding out how organisms respond. Now, unfortunately, we're probably at the point where the die is cast. There's nothing we can do right now that will probably change the fate of the decreasing pH in the ocean. But what we can do is understand what some of the ramifications will be and hopefully be prepared for those. Okay, so enough with doom and gloom. Now what I'd like to do is talk to you about fun stuff that we've discovered about the ocean using our remotely operated vehicles and our autonomous vehicles. Well, first of all, researchers at my institution, particularly Bruce Robeson, have been exploring the Earth's midwater. Now, the Earth's midwater lies below the photic zone, so below the zone that has sunlight, but above the bottom of the ocean. So it's the area of the planet in the ocean that's in perpetual darkness. It's Earth's largest living space, and it contains more biomass and more biodiversity than all of the rainforests combined. When Bob Hanner talked about, that big space of all the organisms we don't know and the little space of the organisms we do know, well, this is a large part of that space that we don't know what the organisms are. Every time we go out, we find new species, new genuses, and sometimes new families. What you just saw here was a pariah. Up here is an animal which we've named Tiburonia gran rojo, which is Tiburon's big red, named after Tiburon, one of our remotely operated vehicles which discovered it. And you can see it's a big kind of jellyfish, big red dome with legs. It's almost the size of this podium, okay? We discovered it just about 3 years ago. It had never before been seen. It was so big we couldn't even capture it with our remotely operated vehicle. So with the little mechanical arm, which weren't too different from the robotic arms you saw earlier today on Jessie, we pinched off a little bit of its tentacle and brought it back for DNA barcoding so that we would know exactly how it fit into the family tree, and found out and indeed it was a new family, a new genus, and a new species. So certainly exploring the midwater has been one area of fruitful discovery in the ocean. But we've also discovered entirely new ecosystems on the bottom of the ocean. This is one that was accidentally discovered on one of our dives with our remotely operated vehicle. And this is a juvenile gray whale that was found at a depth of 3,000 meters in Monterey Bay. And we watched over the months as species came in to feast off this gray whale. Now you can imagine the bottom of the ocean is actually a pretty impoverished place. And when this whale died, suddenly 7 tons of food was delivered to the bottom of the ocean. So this was a feast of magnificent proportion, and of course, just like uninvited guests at a wedding, they moved in pretty quickly to feed off it. And we found that 40% of all the species at the site are found only on whale falls, nowhere else, which leads to a very interesting question of how do they find the whale falls. These are pretty rare occurrences, but yet 40% of the species are found only in that location. One of the most unusual ones we found was this worm, which we named Osidex frankpressi after Frank Press, who was a member of our board of directors who was retiring from our board. And so we thought, okay, well, we'll name a new species after him. It was actually a new family, a new genus, and a new species. And so this is Frank Press's whale eater. And this worm grows these biogreen roots which invade the bone marrow of the whales and feed off the bone marrow. But yet this worm has no mouth, no stomach, and no digestive system. And the way it's able to feed off it is it has at the ends of its roots these bacterial symbionts which extract the lipids from the bone and feed it into the worm. So it was a very new feeding strategy that we found in this worm. What was more unusual about Ocedox frankpressi was that all of the animals we brought back to the lab were all females. So we thought, well, this is very strange. Why would they all be women? Where are the men? Well, Shana Goffretti, who's one of our postdocs, looked very closely, and she found that inside the bodies of the females were literally hundreds of dwarf parasitic males. And what's interesting is all of the males of the species are they only develop to the point where they can produce sperm, and then they're in arrested development after that. So this is yet another interesting strategy for sexual reproduction. If you aren't going to have the babies, you only grow up big enough to have sperm, and then that's it. And so what we're looking at, in looking closer at the evolution of these worms is, we can ask the question, is this an early form of sexual reproduction, or is this a later form of sexual reproduction? And I know, every time I talk about this, the men I see in the audience start squirming. Okay, now, of course, going down in the deep sea, we don't just go down and look. We have to take measurements down there. And this is our equivalent of that little Radio Shack device that Bill Hanner showed. This is a device that can read DNA barcodes and read it in the ocean. This is called the Environmental Sample Processor. What you see here is the first version of it, which was almost as tall as this podium. The later version, we now have a second generation of it, which is about half as high. So it's not quite as small as that Radio Shack version that Bob Hanner was talking about, but at least we're getting there. And what this device does is on a pre-programmed schedule, it takes in a water sample, it filters it for the microorganisms, it disrupts the cell membrane to release the genetic material, it applies molecular probes to look for the RNA barcode, and it telemeters the result back to shore. So it tells us what's in the ocean and how many there are, and it also tells us what they're doing out there. So we can look for organisms that are processing nitrogen or methane or other things like that. So what are some of the things that we've been able to discover in the ocean for this? Well, it turns out that this device was really developed to look at the microbial ocean. In one drop of seawater, there are 1,000 organisms. But 99% of them can't be cultured in the lab. And because you can't culture them in the lab, you can't tell what they're doing out there because you can't grow them under controlled conditions. And so by using this device, we can look for specific RNA sequences that tell us what they're doing out in the ocean. Now, prior to work by Ed DeLong at my institute, most bacteria in these drops of seawater were thought to be heterotrophs. So now, what are heterotrophs? Okay, well, there are basically two organisms. Autotrophs can create their own energy to live, grow, and reproduce without other organisms. For example, plants use sunlight to create energy. Or in this case, in a deep sea vent community, there are chemosynthetic bacteria that break the bonds in hydrogen and sulfide and use that energy to feed the food chain here. They're the bottom of the food chain as plants are the bottom of the food chain in the upper ocean. Now, heterotrophs depend on the consumption of other living matter to live. And it was thought prior to DeLong's discovery that all the bacteria in the ocean were actually heterotrophs, or at least most of them. There were some that had a form of blue-green photosynthesis. But what DeLong found was that as much as 20% of all the bacteria in the ocean have in their cell wall a protein called proteorhodopsin. And what this protein does is when a photon of sunlight hits it, it expels a proton from inside the cell to the outside, which creates a charge difference across the cell wall, and that energy they use to create ATP, which is the currency for cellular functioning. So what you can imagine is this is a biobattery in its simplest form. Each of these bacteria can create a charge difference, so it's like a little biological battery, and it creates it from sunlight without going through the much more complicated process of photosynthesis. So this is a new energy flow in the ocean, which actually helped to explain some of the missing energy balance in the ocean food chain. Now, another fun discovery from the ocean is the fact that methane hydrate, you see a piece of ice that's burning here. It's literally the ice that burns. It's the largest remaining source of fossil fuel on the planet, and it lies buried beneath the continental margins. But unfortunately, we know no way now to recover this energy potential because of the fact that this ice is buried underneath the surface of the ocean, and it's unlike petroleum, you can't pump it out. Unlike coal, you can't mine it. Because it's an ice, once you start bringing it up to the surface, it melts, and all of the methane goes up into the atmosphere before you can capture it. So it's been a big challenge. And a lot of energy companies would very much like to be able to recover this energy, but we don't know how to do it. Well, one thing we've discovered is that the microbes have actually found a way. It involves a novel collaboration between methane-consuming archaea and sulfate-reducing bacteria. And they formed what is result, it's a deep-sea fuel cell. And the way this works is that everyone had predicted that there was no way that these methane-consuming archaea should be able to separate the carbon from the hydrogen in the methane because thermodynamically it shouldn't happen. Thermodynamically it's considered impossible. And the reason is that the partial pressure of hydrogen builds up and forces the thermodynamics in the other way. But what happens by the collaboration with the sulfate-reducing bacteria is the sulfate-reducing bacteria strip off the hydrogen fast enough and combine it with sulfide that they keep that partial pressure of hydrogen low so that the reaction can continue. Now you can imagine if these microorganisms have figured out how to create in the deep sea a fuel cell, we should be able to do the same kind of process down there. The beauty of this is that it creates the ingredient for the fuel cell, elemental hydrogen. The waste product from this ultimately is carbon dioxide, but the carbon dioxide stays in the deep sea rather than going up into the atmosphere where it adds to global warming. So just to conclude, I've just given you a couple examples of some of the fun things to be discovered under the ocean. Often I felt sort of kind of like this little boy in the front of the boat. You kind of want to stick your head down under there. But the important thing is we still can't predict what remains to be discovered. And so many times people will ask me, well, you know, what's going to be the next big thing that your institute's going to come up with? And that's the fun thing about exploration, is that you can't necessarily predict what's going to be discovered. All you can say is whatever it will be, it's something that we haven't even imagined before. And the beauty about exploration is, in comparison to research, where research one starts out with a hypothesis and tries to test that hypothesis, that exploration leads to those questions that motivate the next generation of research questions. And that's why I think regardless whether we're talking about space or whether we're talking about the bottom of the ocean, it's important that we continue to explore. So thank you very much.